if you've got a problem where your coalition is splintering, is it a good idea to further legitimise that and push them in that direction?
When you are going out and you're becoming a voice, and almost an alternative power base to the PM, that's where things get tricky.
There is a cost associated with being outspoken, with organising against your own government, and that there is a line that you cannot cross. No?
I personally think over time it weakens them, but we'll see.
I don't see myself as a rebel. I really focus on supporting a Labour government, but I'm not afraid to debate and to speak up for what's in the interests of my constituents.
I'm incredibly disappointed. I mean, I'm devastated. I'm a proud Labour Party member, and I have been for quite some years, and I still think that the Labour Party is the true vehicle for positive social mobility and actually making the country a much fairer and equal place.
Brian Leishman, and before that, Rachel Maskell. They are 2 MPs of 4 who have now had the Labour whip removed. In other words, they've been suspended, kicked out of the party for now. What is the message Keir Starmer is trying to send?
And is it a sign of Keir Starmer's strength, virility, power, or a real sign of his fundamental weakness? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And yesterday there were lots of end-of-term metaphors flying around Westminster, with Kemi Badenoch giving her end-of-term report to Keir Starmer on how he'd done as Prime Minister. And in that end-of-term feel, 4 of the naughty people were called into the headmaster's office and to be told they're being suspended. In other words, 4 Labour MPs who have been gobby and rebellious were told, you're out, you're on your ear, you're no longer getting the Labour whip. And it comes, of course, after Keir Starmer had that massive rebellion and then the climb down over welfare reform. And it seemed that persistent offenders had been called in to be told, you're out.
Yeah, and those 4 MPs are Brian Leishman, Neil Duncan-Jordan, Chris Hinchliffe, as well as Rachel Maskell. They're not, I guess, household names in the Labour Party, but they are all, I guess, in the Prime Minister's eyes, serial offenders. And the question that we're asking today really is whether he becomes safer or less safe as a result of this, and what to make of the timing of it. Why you choose this week, just before recess, Parliament ends next Tuesday, why you would do this now, whether it is fear of what's coming or whether it is a sort of cleaning out of the cupboards before the summer holidays begin.
I think there is a curious one, this. I mean, to do it before the summer recess, to do it on a day when actually the Tories were attacking each other over the Afghan leak in different ways. So it's an interesting thing about why they might have done it. I mean, one justification or one reason, I think, basically, is, something quite straightforward, is I think they're thinking about future votes. In a weird sort of way, one of the things, and we've talked about it on the show before, one of the things that's sort of weirdly surprising about this government is that despite the fact it has this huge majority, it's weirdly more fragile than it appears. We've seen that transpire repeatedly over the course of this parliamentary term. There are tough votes to come on send education, for example, and potentially other things. I mean, when we get to, I think they're thinking about not necessarily the budget votes, but some of the things that might be coming down the track with the fiscal situation as it is come the autumn. I think they're sending a message to Labour MPs that this sort of thing that we've seen over the course of the last month or two is not going to be tolerated. Not just tolerated, but I think they think that some of these votes are going to be so important for that wider fiscal situation. There's going to probably, I think, come a point when the mettle of the government is tested again, and it is seen as something that tests the Chancellor and the Prime Minister's fiscal credibility. So this is, I think, a sort of, it feels like a small thing. I think in a weird way it's quite a big thing.
Look, people are saying, how can Keir Starmer reconcile what he did yesterday with his statement that, look, we've got to listen more and I've got to listen more to the backbenchers and I've got to be more attuned to their concerns, and how could you possibly kick people out if you're also saying at the same time, I'm going to be on a listening exercise? And I think actually you can. It's not only that Keir Starmer needs to listen, which he clearly does, because as we have previously discussed, the whole operation around the welfare reform proposals was amateur and calamitous, as it turned out. But also the backbenchers have to listen and learn, which is that, there is a very tight fiscal situation, that Rachel Reeves has a black hole that she's trying to fill in, And you can't just keep saying no to everything and organising against the government that's got you elected and put you into the Houses of Parliament.
Although, I mean, they did force the government into a position that the government itself says now was the right one. So it is logically a bit of a weird one.
It is a weird one, but surely you've got to show that. I mean, exactly as you say, Lewis. Look, there is a cost associated with being outspoken, with organising against your own government, and that there is a line that you cannot cross. No?
So I've been speaking to somebody very close to the heart of government, and it was interesting to hear their assessment that this came, I think, from Keir Starmer himself, right from Keir Starmer himself, and that there were others around him, experienced MPs, saying, you know, there are other ways of doing this. You do not have to withdraw the whip. And that the reasoning he was giving was not for being on a different side of a specific political issue, like welfare. It was for the serial organising that they were doing publicly. And that basically was what it came down to, that when you are going out and you're becoming a voice, and almost an alternative power base to the PM, that's where things get tricky. So if you're actually rallying groups of 50 MPs, it's not about, oh, I feel really strongly about, you know, disabled people, or I feel really strong about winter fuel, or I feel strong about this. It's like, are you actually setting yourself up in opposition to your own leader? And I mean, I think one of the questions is, I mean, from this person, certainly, why he didn't do it a week earlier. You know, it feels almost late that he's doing it now. But when I asked whether they expected the whip to be returned, this person said, almost certainly, like 6 months. So there is a world in which you get the summer out of the way when you don't need your numbers, you don't need your majority for any votes. You say, OK, you know, July, August, pretty much by December, they're being welcomed back in. And you make sure that the lesson has been learned, the signal has been clear, they're back in line and they will vote with the party.
But if they then continue to rebel, then you've got, Starmer looks ridiculous. Right, you've been naughty boy, are you promising to behave? 6 months, you're out. After 6 months, you come back in and you misbehave again.
Well, I guess that brings us to the Diane Abbott question today, doesn't it? Where, you know, the mother of the house now, the longest serving MP, Diane Abbott at Hackney, has basically reiterated the same claims that she made in a letter to the Observer 3 years ago, and said she stands by them. Now, those claims, which were that she thought black people suffered a different kind of racism to Jewish people, to Irish people, to travellers, and she said, I stand by what I said. Even though the first time she said it,
she apologised.
She apologised and then had the whip removed and only just got it back before the last election. So it's a really interesting, to your point, you know, do people want to actually have that sense of, you know, re-establishing their own slightly knotty identity vis-a-vis the
Or
Prime
do they
Minister?
want martyrdom?
Well, and our Labour source is saying this afternoon that it's very likely that Abbott's going to lose the whip as a result of it, and so we're just back to square one.
I mean, she must have known. I mean, personally, I don't understand why those comments are very offensive as a you know, as a
But
Jewish
if you've
person.
apologised and then unapologised, I mean, it's a bit of a weird.
Well, I think we all understand a political apology, which is like, you know, don't kick me out of your party, I'll say whatever you want to. Most apologies are written for you, aren't they?
Yeah, sure, but then to retract it, to retract the apology and is almost then the corollary of what you've just said, Emily, is that what Diane Abbott is saying, right, now I do want you to kick me out of the party.
So do you think she wants to join the Corbyn Sultana
party?
party?
I don't know. I mean, it looks like she's go and make my day. You know, it's a Clint Eastwood, make my day. Go on, if you want to pull the trigger.
I mean, and that's the other thing, right, is that there's a question I think about, is this a sign of strength or is it a sign of frailty and weakness?
Yeah.
And I think it's a sign of weakness for quite a few reasons. I mean, one is, I think it's going to make him weaker over the long term, right? Because even people within the PLP who don't necessarily like the people who've lost the whip, they're not on the left, this is quite an unusual thing. It's an unusual thing to take the whip away in these circumstances from people who might have only rebelled a handful of times, right? I mean, famously, of course, Jeremy Corbyn rebelled 500 times against the whip with Tony Blair, and he didn't lose the whip. So who knows? Maybe Rachel Maskell will be leader of the Labour Party in like 5 years' time. So who knows? But the point is why didn't Blair do that? Well, Blair didn't care about these people. No. It was coming from he was in a position of supreme political strength, and not just because he had a big majority, just like Keir Starmer did, but because Blair had a real political project, and I think that
more money, to be fair, and a lot more money underneath him to back up the stuff that he needed to do.
Of course, the wider circumstances were better, but nonetheless, he had a sense of political project, and his project was bigger than being an internal project. And one of the reasons I think this is basically a sign of political weakness is because ultimately, one of the reasons this has happened is because Starmerism, for want of a better expression, the Starmer project has largely always been an internal Labour Party thing. It has always been about the purification against the left. That's how it was born. That's basically how they expected it to be. So when their backs are against the wall, the pressure valve for Number 10 and for Starmer himself is, let's smash the left. And that sends out a signal. And I think that is a good part of what we're seeing here.
Except you're hearing from loyalist MPs now, and I've, had messages from quite a few saying, as they would, 100% back this, because actually the people around were making it a nightmare for them. They were making it a nightmare for surrounding MPs. And if you've got people who are kind of constantly tugging at your sleeve saying, oh God, I know you don't really believe that. I know you don't really want to see this happening, do you? It's kind of very destabilising to the people who are actually trying to get on with the bigger project, which is whatever government looks like, and getting bills through.
But these weren't manifesto commitments. If they'd been manifesto commitments, it would be different. Ultimately, like our system is, I agree, look, you need party coherence, and that's fair enough. But this is going over and above that than what we've seen before, because ultimately, MPs are elected to exercise their judgment. They're not there, as they are in other systems, to always, under all circumstances, take the whip. And that is the important part. There is a balance, but I don't think that the people we're seeing here, some of them are a little, clearly, a couple of them in particular, I think it's fair to say, enjoy the limelight, as MPs often do. I think it's a question of proportion. And like I say, I don't really...
But it's not just the limelight. It's when you are actually manoeuvring big groups of other MPs into your orbit.
But a majority of the PLP didn't want it. They would argue, I think they would say, that they allowed those... you could see it a different way, which is these people were braver, they went out there, they forced the government to do what actually a majority of the PLP wanted. So you can see it either way, can't you? You can either see it as self-indulgence, or you can see it as them taking the bullets.
But I don't think anyone's...
As them taking the bullets for people who didn't have the guts to do it.
And thought, oh, we've had a really great legislative year, have they? They really have.
But that's not down to those four people. That's down to government whips being cack-handed with it and a lack of direction from the centre.
But comparing it to the Blair years, it is different. When Jeremy Corbyn was a backbencher, Blair was the Prime Minister, and there was Skinner, and there were a few others who were part of the awkward squad. You knew where their opposition was. They weren't organising in the way publicly of WhatsApp groups, because there weren't WhatsApp groups then. And it is the public...
Tuition fees? Iraq? No one lost the whip over that.
No, but they didn't lose... But it didn't feel like you had the same kind of level of organisation that you've got now.
I think the organisation is key on this.
I just think it's more public than it was.
More public and less coded. I think that you get people on now and they kind of know that if they're going to get clicks and they're going to get attention, you've got to really go out there and not just give a coded criticism of what the Prime Minister is doing.
We criticised, I think rightly, when Boris Johnson expelled, 30 Tory MPs from the Conservative Party because they voted against his version of Brexit, I think we all probably thought that was a bad thing. Yeah. Like, what's the difference?
Because these people have been persistently organising.
Those people were persistently organising in those years, John, in the Brexit years. Like, they were way worse than these people. And actually, arguably, Johnson had more justification because Brexit was the centrepiece of the point of that government, and they were stopping that from happening. So I think it's one or the other. Either Johnson was right and Starmer's right, or they're both wrong.
I just think that's, it's like the old joke about the American who's in his car and he stops the Irishman in Southern Ireland and said, how do I get to here? How do I get to wherever? And the Irishman says, well, I wouldn't have started from here. And Keir Starmer is starting now. He's in this position today where he's lost a lot of authority and he's thinking, what can I do to shore it up?
That's not entirely right, that parallel there, because don't forget, a lot of the MPs that lost the whip then lost the whip because they refused to let Johnson entertain the idea of a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah.
And they also refused to take Parliament out of the equation. One of them was Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, who heard Boris Johnson's plans for proroguing Parliament and said, I cannot stand here as a constituency MP and allow our role, Parliament's role, to be absolutely eroded by the executive.
But a lot of
I think it's a very, very different...
No, I don't...
A
I think
very
you just...
different circumstance
No, I
to what
just-
Starmer's saying, which is like, you know, this is what you stood for when I was elected, and we're going to get
But he
this
didn't
stuff
stand
done.
up. I mean, like Johnson was elected as leader of the Conservative Party to, quote, get Brexit done. I mean...
No, that came before. Remember, Get
Yeah, I
Brexit
know.
Done.
Yeah, sure, but-
was in December,
was in December
of 2019,
I know.
and this was in
but
September.
what I'm saying is, I mean, I think a lot of those MPs ended up actually getting voted out because they voted against the programme motion for the withdrawal bill, right? Like, so I think you know, for those Labour MPs, they would probably say, I think they would say that for them, Dominic Grieve found, you know, parliamentary sovereignty as important, goes to his core. For them, welfare goes to their core, and I don't really see why one would be substantially different than the other. It goes down to what you most value and cherish in your politics as an individual MP.
So the question surely has to be, will this make any difference? Will this make any difference come the autumn? Because the success or failure will be not whether we think his authority is weakened or strengthened. It's whether people are going to rebel openly in the way that, you know, over special educational needs or whatever it happens to be, or fiscal measures that Rachel Reeves
Well, I guess
might
the
have
next step is what happens to the four that have gone. Do they join? I mean, there were questions about whether Brian Leishman, one of them, who's the MP up in Scotland, Grangemouth, would he join the SNP? You know, will Rachel Maskell join Zara Sultana and
right.
Jeremy Corbyn? You know,
exactly.
I mean, that's what this summer could look like. It could be quite an interesting sort of, you know, reshuffle away from cabinet.
Well, that's what I mean. You know, if you've got a problem where your coalition is splintering, is it a good idea to further legitimise that and push them in that direction? I don't think so, personally, but I can see why those around Starmer think it might be, because that is their reflexive instinct, and they actually think it strengthens them. I personally think over time it weakens them, but we'll see.
We'll be back after the break with the latest on the Afghan data leak, and Lewis has been in court this morning. Well, Lewis has just come back from court, which is something we've known that he's been in and out of court
Lewis
for the past...
Casey.
Yeah, exactly. Or the
Suit.
defendant.
Yeah, that's a nice suit.
It's a nice suit.
I'll just do the tea.
Yeah. What do you call a Lewis Goodall in a suit? A defendant. You've been doing this for the last 2 years, and we obviously haven't been able to say that you've been coming in and out of court because it's all been absolutely secret until now. I've seen that the Intelligence and Security Committee are flexing muscles and saying, what the hell? Why haven't we been informed about all of this? Are you going to hand over these papers? Tell us about court this morning.
Yeah, so look, there's a couple of developments on this story, and it feels as if, basically, in a way, the different parts of the British state which normally would have been aware of anything like this, are sort of waking up to the implications of what's happened. Let's start with the Intelligence Committee first. Now, the Intelligence and Security Committee, for people who don't know, this is a very, very powerful body within Parliament. It's made up of members of the House of Lords and members of the House of Commons. They're security cleared. Their job is to scrutinise the work of the intelligence services and matters relating to classified material. Under various bits of legislation which govern the way it operates, it would normally always be informed of something like this, a super injunction being applied in a way that it has been applied, and this huge operation to resettle people from Afghanistan, as we've been reporting on all week. Now, the Intelligence and Security Committee were not informed of all of this. Indeed, I was at a court hearing when the judge involved actually asked why the Intelligence and Security Committee had not been involved, because at least that would have been some parliamentary scrutiny. They hear stuff that's more classified than this all the time, is my understanding. At least that would have been some limited parliamentary scrutiny. And the government lawyer at the time said, well, there are questions about the sensitivity relating to these matters and informing certain politicians on this. Now, there's a question, therefore, as to whether the government broke the law in not informing them. And the Intelligence and Security has been meeting today in some anger, and they've issued a statement about all of this. And they said, following correspondence on Tuesday from MOD ministers regarding the loss of data relating to Afghan relocations and assistance policy applicants in February 2022, the committee has today written to require, under the statutory powers the committee has, that defence intelligence and joint intelligence organisation assessments must be provided to us immediately together with any other intelligence assessments referred to in the case. The reason this matters, remember, people who've listened to our episodes on this will know, this entire case rests on that first assessment made at the beginning by the Ministry of Defence, that if this data set got into the hands of the Taliban, it would represent a lethal threat to those involved. We now know the government has turned around and said, actually, we're not sure it is such a lethal threat. So what the committee want to see is that initial defence assessment that we have never seen. And I've spoken to a source on the committee who is sceptical about that initial assessment. Who knows whether it even exists in the way the government has suggested it has. Because remember, so much of this, even in court, is taken on face value on what the government says. So this is a very serious charge, because if the government has misled the court about that initial assessment, it is contempt of court and very serious.
Yeah, just on that, the government could have broken the law. What's the sanction?
Well, there could potentially be contempt of court sanctions for those involved and officials. Now, John, obviously, the question is, as with all of this stuff, if anyone is ever going to be held accountable, because so far I'm not sure anyone will be. But nonetheless, there is some form, right? People might already be getting echoes. A government comes along with an assessment about intelligence that turns out to be...
Not quite right.
Not quite right, or not quite as billed, although at least we saw that assessment. The point of the matter is, the fact of the matter is that, you know, parliamentarians who, as I say, we've been saying all week, they've been denied the right to scrutinise this stuff. They're waking up to that fact and starting to ask some very serious questions about what has gone on.
I mean, if the point of a super injunction is that you can't even mention it because you risk being sent to prison, then presumably the punitive sort of sanction of that is enough to stop people from leaking it. Mm-hmm. So it makes no sense for them not to tell the chair of the body that's literally called the Intelligence Committee. And just to your point, it's not that the whole committee expects to know, it's not that every member expects to know, but the chair. And somebody that I was talking to said, look, if this was in the US, if there was a moment at which the chairs hadn't been told about this, it would have been blue murder, frankly. That the difference between the respect for these bodies here and in the US is massive. And I think you can both believe that the injunction was the right thing to do, as actually many still in the security community do, but still prefer to be informed of it. And by not informing those people, I guess you risk creating a backlash of people who are even more suspicious that they've missed out on something that wasn't right in the first place anyway.
Well, just to go back to the centrality of this assessment. I mean, this is something the judge himself in the case and in his judgment this week has expressed concern about. So Justice Chamberlain presided over the case, said he discharged the super injunction that the MOD needed, and when he did so, said the Ministry of Defence must explain more about the basis of the secret intelligence. He noted that the MOD's original assessments in 2023 were very different from its recent review, which he said could only be put down in parts to the passage of time. He said an examination of the way the initial assessments in this case were prepared and whether the courts were or are generally right to accord such weight to assessments of this kind is a matter for consideration. And Mark Stevens, a media lawyer, has said that is judicial language for I'm very concerned that the court and the court system has been abused by the government.
It's so interesting, isn't it? It's the way decision making works in government. And, you know, on this podcast, we said our job, I can remember on sort of day one, our job is to pull a curtain back on how the decision making is made, you know, in all these areas of power in our public life. And what we are seeing is a curtain being pulled back where you can just imagine a minister telling to a civil servant or whatever civil servant, look, make this. We need a report. We need to make this look as dire as possible. And then Labour comes into power. You know, Labour comes into power, wants to get rid of the super injunction. We need a report that makes it look like it's not as bad.
I don't understand that. I just want to go back to your last line. The idea that the courts have been abused by the government, because I thought we'd understood that the person who suggested the super injunction was the judge himself.
Indeed so. But on the basis of, I think what the main judge in the case is suggesting is that the government may have misled him and misled his court as well about the nature of the initial defence assessment.
There is, I mean, you've mentioned the kind of the spectre of the 45 minutes and the dodgy dossier. There is another spectre that comes up. I don't know if this is too strong. I'm just sort of trying it out now. But there was absolute uproar when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, right? And I remember we were all in the Labour Party conference. I think one Keir Starmer was actually on the stage when Lady Hale came back with her decision that it had been unlawful and that the prorogation could not go ahead. I mean, it was only the beginning of the prorogation. She stopped it being extended. But it does seem to point to the same kind of clash, essentially, which is the executive trying to stop the legislature from doing their job through a very heavy-handed use of the judiciary, right? And the judiciary, at that time, with the prorogation, came out and said, you can't do this. At this time, the judiciary is being used as the tool by which they could. Now, I have to say, in the fullness, a lot of the people I've spoken to did not have a problem with that super injunction. They, as I said, I think more and more it is dividing down party lines. It is dividing down people who think that nothing is a greater priority in public life than, intelligence, national security and all the rest of it. And I think maybe there is a leaning from the Conservative side towards that, and there's a leaning towards transparency from the Labour side. But I think that whole sense of whether the executive is putting in things in place that have never, ever been tried before, because it then takes Parliament out of the question completely, is a bit like prorogation.
I think there are real parallels with that. And the judiciary reacting very badly to the idea that they are being used. I think the point about this is that in this case, even the judge who obviously sat through all of the closed material and sessions as well in a way we didn't, ultimately he has to take on face value the assessments that he's given and the things the government say about those assessments. So he has to take those things on face value. So what I think he is saying there, and I think what the Intelligence and Security Committee are saying, is that it is important for these assessments to be seen in full and to actually confirm that they exist. Because if they don't exist, or they don't exist in the way as billed, that is a very serious thing for the government to have misled the court about, and therefore the whole basis of the super injunction, which has been the basis for Parliament being denied its right to know about what was going on, falls away.
Can I just ask about one other thing that sort of puzzles me? I have seen reporting on the BBC from my former colleague Richard Bilton. I've read reports in newspapers as well that seem to be going beyond anything that is normally in the public domain. Now, is that because these newspapers have squirreled out facts that we didn't know about, or...
I was going to say, the other place that we're starting to hear a real disquiet is from the people who are actually doing the government financial calculations. The National Audit Office is another body which is now coming forward and saying, I think we should have known about this, because the money that you're spending, whether it's on relocation, whether it's, on future court cases, on sort of class actions, is something that will come out of affect government coffers. This is taxpayer money. And actually, why wasn't the National Audit Office involved in discussions of quite what this would mean for the British state? I mean, we speak every other week on this podcast about the minuscule amount of financial headroom that the Chancellor has to do things with. And the fact that whatever the sum ends up being, at the moment I think it's 400 million. But if that doubles...
Well, it's 800 million, it's 400 million so far, and another 400 million.
Exactly. So there you've got, you're just south of $1 billion, right? At some point, somebody who's doing the government maths probably needs to know about this too.
The extraordinary thing is that years and years ago, when I was Paris correspondent, it came to light that there was this thing called les fonds secrets, which dated from the Second World War, where a Bank of France van would drive around government departments and deliver 500 franc notes to the minister in that department to do with as he saw fit. There was no accountability, and it was only ended in the early 2000s when I was in Paris. And it dated from the Second World War and the resistance and the idea that we had to be able to do things in a clandestine way, and it carried on. You would think that in 2025...
Weird that they didn't shut that one down, isn't it? Weird that those French ministers
and of course they were for entertaining and doing whatever and paying for mistresses, the whole bloody 9 yards. It was so corrupt. The idea that in Britain today there is still hundreds of millions of pounds being spent
Unaccounted for.
I
guess the
where
government
we
will say, we accounted for it, we just didn't
tell you
tell
where it
you.
was being spent.
And up to a point, we can't tell everyone everything because that is not a super injunction.
Well, I mean, and that's just the cost of resettlement, which, by the way, 800 million is I think basically going to be the lowest estimate. I think it's very likely that it runs into the billions in the end. And part of that cost, that's just the resettlement cost. Part of the other cost, which is now is starting to gear up, you've already referred to it, Emily, is the compensation.
Yeah,
the compensation, the class actions. I mean, we sat in court with a law firm we talked about the other day, Bearings. They've got over 600 cases already, just ready to go. I was talking to a source yesterday, and they were saying the way to think about this is going to be by far and away, let's just think about the compensation, by far and away, the biggest and most expensive data breach the British government will have ever paid for. Why is that? Well, obviously there's the numbers, there's 18,000. But the way they put it to me to think about it is, usually when a data breach happens and the government has to pay some compensation, it's often quite like minor data. It might be your email address, maybe your telephone number, more serious, maybe even your address, quite serious. But this is all right to life stuff. They said the way to think about it is the closest thing that it comes to would be if there was a data breach, which has very occasionally happened, on a witness protection program.
Yeah, exactly.
And this has happened to 18,000 people, plus their dependents. So just think about how expensive that might end up being.
They're assuming that there aren't going to be 18,000 petitioners on this class action, not least because half of them, now out of
Rachel Reeves Black Hole could be about to get a whole lot bigger.
The data set is out there, and there will be law firms who may be able to obtain the data set and literally use it to go through the contact details and say to them, it'll be like this really sinister, dark, horrendous Afghan. It'll be really this really dark, sinister, horrendous version, almost like PPI or something. It's kind of like so comprehensive. There will be people ringing them up and going, "Has your data been stolen or lost?" And the government have literally set up a website where you can check for yourself. So it is this weird thing. When this source was talking to me, saying that the Ministry of Defence is thinking, could easily be £250 million plus, if not way more. So this is just starting. The financial consequences of this, which you might say are second order by comparison to right to life and everything, but nonetheless, the financial consequences of this are only just starting to unravel and unroll.
We'll be back in just a moment on whether 16-year-olds should be able to vote in the general election. Before we go, the government has announced today that 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote in time for the next general election. A change of the law. No longer 18 is the voting age. It's come down to 16. Starmer says if you're old enough to go out to work, then people who are 16 and 17 years old and are old enough to pay taxes, they're old enough to vote as well. Contrary, Tories are saying, if you're too young to go to war or get married or even stand in elections, then you're too young to vote. And it is a kind of really interesting mismatch, isn't it? Because I always thought it was absurd and unacceptable that the idea that you could die for your country but not be able to vote for the government that sends you to war to die for your country. But now we've got a situation where 16 you can vote, but you've still got to be older before you can join the armed forces.
Yeah, I think what it really speaks to is what each party thinks it will do to their voter base. And clearly, Labour believes that there are more people who would naturally vote Labour in the 16 to 18 group, and the Tories are dead worried that nobody of that age would vote Tory. And so I think that's what you're seeing in the reaction. And ITV News has just come out with quite an interesting poll on the back of this announcement by Angela Rayner. We should say, the Rayner announcement comes this morning almost entirely overshadowed by, the suspension of the 4 MPs. This is what happens when you sort of, make a big dramatic action. You are in danger of making this story, the and finally, as opposed to the lead story, which it might otherwise have been. Well, I went to More in Common for some thoughts on what this might mean, Luke Trill. And he's pointed out that one of the things to think about with sort of 16 to 17-year-olds voting is first taking into account turnout, your point. They would probably not make up more than about 2% of the electorate. I mean, that's not huge. But if you're talking about hyperfragmentation and lots of, smaller parties getting a smaller percentage of the share that could still ultimately change who's in power, then that does become significant. And he did some work on how the 16-year-old vote might have changed the last election.
It didn't. It wouldn't.
Not very much.
No.
Yeah, not very much. So if they vote in the same way that 18 to 24-year-olds, and is there any reason to think that 16 to 18 wouldn't, then actually there would have been very little difference.
2 predictions. The turnout will be really low among 16 to 18-year-olds, and there'll be a very large number of that small turnout who will vote Reform. Because we've seen it elsewhere. We've seen the pattern in America.
A very low number who vote Reform.
No, a very large number that vote Reform. It will be a very low percentage of 16 to 18-year-olds who vote, but of that low percentage, a large number will vote Reform. Yeah, many more might vote Labour, but a large number, nevertheless, will vote Reform. And we've seen that pattern in America in last November's election, where young people, the young bro vote, we talked about it a lot, were going to go for Donald Trump. And that sure enough as hell happened. We saw it with the most recent German elections, where Alternative for Deutschland were polling very well among young people too. It's probable the same thing will happen here, even though at the moment Reform are saying we shouldn't be extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds.
There's good news for one former party leader in this poll, going back to the ITV numbers, which is that Jeremy Corbyn comes out as most favoured amongst the young. He has very high approval ratings, and after him, the kind of figures that the young say they'd vote for: Greta Thunberg, 27%, the YouTuber Mr. Beast on 21%, and, drumroll, Jeremy Clarkson on 17%. And so it's really interesting that I think the young are probably more politically engaged than ever before, but it's politically engaged without all the kind of, the stability that used to come from generations of 18-year-olds. People without houses, people without mortgages, exactly. people probably who are, maybe 2 decades away from marriage or any kind of formal sort of family commitment. You might not be even thinking about marriage until you're close to 40 now. So that's 20 years of the vote without that being at all relevant to how you're living your life, right?
Look, we've talked about how in America, do the Democrats need to have a celebrity candidate at the next presidential election who can rival the sort of luster that Donald Trump or someone like that brings? With 16-year-olds, it's going to be the latest TikTok trend or the latest YouTube influencer or whatever it happens to be. You could just see someone coming along. I think that polling of, who are the people that young people would vote for kind of shows that it's great to widen the franchise, to have the largest number of people voting, but it comes with risks as well.
Yeah, and I think the clearest thing it tells us is that the next election will be, I would say now the TikTok election, but whatever comes after TikTok. That everything is going to be fought in the medium of social media from now on. You aren't going to look up and see a party political broadcast that has any kind of sway at all.
We will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.